my terms. I wanted to present them unbiased in his own words. So when he talks about what his theory is, I wanted to use his words. So this comes right out of Origin of Species. The idea that each species has been independently created is erroneous. I am fully convinced that species are not immutable or unchanging, but that those belonging to the same genera are lineal descendants of some other and generally extinct species. In the same manner as the acknowledged varieties of any one species are the descendants of that species. Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the most important, but not the exclusive means of modification. So what on earth does that mean?
Okay, good.
Evolution, in his own words, is the theory of descent with modification through variation and natural selection. That is what evolution is. He didn't call it evolution. That is a more modern term. What he called it is the theory of descent with modification. Now, what that means is I am the descendant of my great-grandfather. I am one of his descendants. That is what he means by descent. He is talking about generational descent. That this generational descent occurs with modification in, not, he wouldn't use these words, but modification in his genetics. You see, the thing is, Mendelian genetics, the paper hadn't even come out when this was going on, okay? Mendel and his peas, has anybody heard of Mendel and his peas?
Mhm.
All right, so that's where we started to understand inheritance and genes and inheritance. And so what he's saying is that those aspects of heredity, are changed and modified through variation in natural selection. Variation, he's referring to the variation of genes. Hey, not everybody is the same. Everybody is a little bit different. You take the hereditary aspects and you shuffle them on through, and there's a lot of variation. Natural selection refers to the pressures of nature and the survival of the fittest. In other words, there are some people that are going to be more adept at surviving than others. There are some creatures more adept at surviving than others. They're going to have little small differences, and those differences will make one organism, one being, whether it's a person or whether it's a moth or whether it's a bacteria, more likely to survive. And he says that all these, there's three propositions that he makes. And as that all parts of the organization and instincts offer individual differences. And I think that we could substitute the word organism here. That all parts of the creature, the organism, and instincts offer individual differences. There is a struggle for existence leading to the preservation of profitable deviations of structure and instinct. In other words, those differences, some will be advantageous and others will not be advantageous. And that gradations in the state of perfection of each organ may have existed, each good of its kind. So, evolution, what is it? It is descent with modification. It is generations coming down, getting a little bit different over time because of these pressures, primarily from natural selection. There is changes in gene frequency through generations. So we've got genes that code for all the information of, color of our eyes, how long our nose is, how big our muscles are, all kinds of different things. And that the frequency of these genes change through the generations. That changes in species from a common ancestor. So what he's referring to here is that a species may change over time based on the pressures that are put against that population. And I'm going to give you some examples to try to get it out of theory and into practical. And that there's a common ancestor, and through descent with modification, all the diversity of life arose on Earth. This is our hang-up right here. That not only do you see within a species change over time, modification, okay, through descent, but that you could have a one-celled organism in the primordial goo that suddenly gets to our human brain with its 200, 300 trillion bits and that amazing specified complexity that makes us who we are. So evolution, how does it work? So what are some of the mechanisms? So first of all, let's talk about the big natural selection. There's genetic variation upon which natural forces act to select a desirable trait, a trait that enhances survival so the organism can reproduce. Look, if you're born and you are slow and you are a part of the food chain of the tiger and you're slow, you're going to get eaten. And if you get eaten, you're not going to reproduce and send on those genes to your progeny. Okay? And if you are also a prey of the tiger and you were born exceptionally fast, there's a good chance that you're going to survive and then pass on those fast genes onto your progeny. That's what it's saying. So it looks kind of like this. If you've got a set of beetles, and there's a mixture, there's green beetles and there's brown beetles, but they're all a part of the same group, okay? They're all a part of the same species. Birds flying through the air will see a bright green beetle before it will see a brown beetle, because they'll blend in with the ground or the tree better. And so they see the bright green, and the bird comes and it eats the green beetle because it sees it faster, it sees it better, and is more likely to eat green beetles. So that over time, what you're going to see is a change in the population from a 50-50 mix of brown and green beetles, and over time, because the green beetles get eaten, you're going to lose the green gene, and you're going to have a predominantly brown beetle population with very few green beetles. That's what natural selection is. Does that make sense to everybody? Another good example is bacteria. You have a population of bacteria growing in your bladder, and you got a bladder infection. So you go and your doctor gives you an antibiotic. And you take that antibiotic for 3 days, and you feel like, man, I feel so much better, I'm going to stop taking my antibiotic, and you put it back up on the shelf because you feel so much better. Well, here's what's happened. Day one, you killed 90% of the bacteria that was in your urinary system. Day two, you killed 90% of what was left over, and day three, you killed 90% of what was left over. So you've got a 1/1000th of the number of bacteria there, but guess what? Those are the bacteria that survived the first 3 days. You put your antibiotics away before you killed every last one of them, and they start growing again. And call your doctor up 2 weeks later and say, my bladder infection is back. Well, guess what? Natural selection has just occurred because you killed off all the weak bacteria. The ones that survived were the ones that survived those 3 days of antibiotics, and now guess what you got? You got yourself a resistant bacteria. You have a new population that has changed over time, okay, through generational change, modification, through descent, through a natural selection process of being exposed to an antibiotic, and the survivors are what's left, and now all of their progeny, they got the resistance gene, and you got a problem, because that antibiotic ain't going to work anymore, okay? That's why you want to take all your antibiotics every single day.
Why they say that?
There's a reason for that.
You don't
This
want
is it right here.
You're right. You don't want evolution in your bladder.
No evolution in the bladder. That's right. Genetic drift. This is another way that things change. Genetic drift this is kind of an interesting little icon here. It makes the point, but I'm gonna tell you what it is a little more naturally. So you've got your population of green and brown beetles, and somebody comes through, and just by pure chance, he's just walking away, and he steps on 90% of the green beetles. So now you suddenly have the same result, but that was not through natural selection. That was just through what we would call genetic drift. So the way that this would happen is you've got a population of elk, let's say, and a certain population of that elk lives in a climate where it lives in a region where there's a volcano, and this volcano erupts and it wipes out 90% of that herd of elk. So there's other elk that are distant areas that are not around that volcano. They have different genetic material. They're the same species, but they have these slight differences. Now all of a sudden, the elk far away are much more prevalent as far as the gene pool for these elk. So that's an example of, in nature, what would happen with genetic drift is the sudden elimination through a catastrophic event of a large population of your species. You then have a change in the gene pool. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so that's genetic drift. Then there's mutation, and that's a random gene change. It's an actual change in the DNA where some of the, we talked about the structure of DNA last week, and it's where there's actual changes in the molecule of the DNA so that you have a different base pairs. And if you remember, every 3 sets of 3 base pairs codes for a particular amino acid protein in the protein. And so if you get one change, that's going to radically change your biochemistry. All right? Almost all mutations are bad. Almost all of them are not selected for. But there is the potential for a good change. So in this case here, you have a population of green beetles. These beetles start off green, and then one guy has a mutation which leads to a brown color instead of a green color. And then that green color becomes a disadvantage. The brown, let me phrase that better. The brown color is an advantage because now the prey on the beetles can't see them as well, and the brown can preserve that mutation to get more of the brown like we see in this first slide here. Okay, so anyway, the point is that we're looking at how there is genetic variation, there's descent with variation, there's descent with change, and this a mutation is another mechanism of descent with change, how the gene pool changes with successive generations. And then finally, migration, which is the movement of one population to another. So you might have, for example, an island of green beetles and an island of brown beetles, and you can have a migration. Let's say the beetles are on an animal that swims to the other island, then all of a sudden there's a migration of brown beetles to the green beetle island, and now all of a sudden you're going to get a change in that genetic diversity just from now mixing those 2 species that have different genetic makeup. So these are the 4 mechanisms of how evolution works. Okay, how you get descent, which is referring to generational descent with modification of the gene pool. All right. So that's evolution. Now here's the problem.
Well, and we see some of that stuff happening today. Like you could kind of, interfere, say, with the evolution of a species if you have, say, you're a dog breeder, and you like really soft furry dogs. So you have a set of puppies, and some are furrier than others, and so the non-furry ones you don't breed, but the extra furry, the furriest ones of all, you breed together with other people's very furry animals. And eventually you'll end up with very, very furry dogs. I mean, that's kind of how the modern species of dog were created. Labradoodles, right, exactly, Labradoodles. But that's not a different species, that's all the same species. But you can see that genetic variation. But it's not really natural selection because a human being is picking.
There's an intelligence that's directing and guiding that process.
Exactly.
And would that be considered a mutation?
Well, mutation may have caused the first increase in furriness. Like when, you bred your dog and it's not a furry dog, but all of a sudden it happened to have one furry baby. And that one furry baby, that may have come as a result of a mutation where the hair just grows longer and doesn't fall out. Right, so now you've got this extra furry baby and you go, ooh, there's a really furry one, I like that. I'm going to breed that one to get more like that.
Right.
And the more often you breed together the furry ones, you'll get a Shih Tzu, say, instead of a boxer.
Okay, well that's very good. I'm going to remember this illustration, remember what Terry's talking about, because I'm going to use that in just a second. Okay, so here's the trouble, guys. This process of natural selection and changes within a species is absolutely and unequivocally identified in science today. We see this happening. Happens all the time. Okay? This happens. There is variety in species, and we can observe this going on, this process. But this is the process of changes within a species. What we have never observed is speciation, where one species turns into another species and a new species is formed. Okay, that has not scientifically been observed in any way, shape, or form. And so what we're doing is we're taking what we would call microevolution, the process of watching this variation within a species. That's microevolution to macroevolution, which is now we're going to use that process to explain new life forms. Okay? And so what I want to go through is the problems on why natural selection cannot explain macroevolution, or the appearance of new species. Atheist Richard Dawkins would say that this, natural selection and evolution, descent with modification, okay, that's Darwin's words, descent with modification, that's what we call evolution, would say that this is the cause of the appearance of design in things. In other words, he seizes on Paley's watchmaking analogy that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and he would say, well, Paley said, look, if you see a watch, you know that there was a watchmaker. Okay, and what Dawkins would say is, no, because of evolution, we have a completely blind watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
We have a blind watchmaker. That it's blind, undirected causes that led to things having the appearance of design. So, what are the problems with natural selection? And I'm going to be very specific about here, new life forms, or speciation, the development of new species. First is genetic limits, and this is a part of what Terry was getting at. We can observe over a short period of time the process of natural selection working, but what we have not witnessed is macroevolution. We have not witnessed this process occurring, creating new species. And it seems that when we look at this, that there are genetic limits that are set in. So Terry was talking about dog breeding, and you can think about dogs all the way from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, okay? Very different in appearance. Some dogs in that spectrum have soft fur, some have wiry fur. Some are small, some are big. Some are long, some are stout. Okay? Some are fast, some are slow. But when we do this with breeding birds, or manipulating corn to get particularly desirable traits in yield, and growing in high water areas or growing in drought areas, and so we manipulate the genetics of corn, as Terry was talking about, human-directed changes. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, you've always got a dog if you're breeding dogs.
Right.
You've always got a stalk of corn if you're breeding corn. And you've always got a bird when you're breeding birds. There seems to be a built-in genetic limit within the species. And so we call that genetic limits.
Are you going to define like what a species is?
Well, why don't you define it for us? Bring it up.
So a species is when you have one individual that can mate with another individual and produce fertile offspring. Okay? So if a horse mates with a horse, their baby horses will be able to have babies. Okay, so you know that horse, that they're in the same species. They're able to mate and reproduce together, and they get fertile offspring. That would be a contrast, say, mating a horse with a donkey, which are not in the same species. They're close enough that if you mate them, they'll make an offspring, right? The offspring of a horse and a donkey is called a mule. But the mule is infertile.
Always.
It cannot have children, and that's why. Because the horse, the parents, the horse and the donkey were not in the same species. Okay, that's the definition of species. If you mate two individuals and they have a baby, that doesn't mean they're in the same species. It's only if you can mate the two individuals and their baby can have babies. And they're fertile. Because what happens with the horse and the donkey is their genes are close enough that they can actually get together and make something that will be alive and functional, but the genes are too far apart that when cell division and stuff happens in reproduction, that it can't make fertile, eggs and sperm and stuff to make any new babies. So basically that genetic change stops at the mule. As soon as you try to cross between species, it's almost like, well, my editorial, God put a limit and said, you can change within a species. You can make big horses, little horses, fat horses, skinny horses. You can make big donkeys, slow donkeys, fast donkeys. But as soon as you try to tamper with the barrier between species, you hit a hard stop, which is there's no evolution coming out of a mule because it won't have babies. So it doesn't matter how hard you try, you'll never ever get a fertile offspring from a horse and a donkey.
Right. Good. So
they can't participate in the evolutionary cycle as Darwin would.
Right. And what we're saying with this is scientifically, with what we observe, there seems to be a hard limit. There needs to be hard genetic limits on species.
Right, and what Darwin has said is, if you get enough changes in the species, eventually you'll get a new species. In other words, fruit flies, if you get enough changes, little changes, it's exposed to heat, it's exposed to dryness, eventually it'll turn into something else other than a fruit fly, and it won't be able to reproduce with its fruit fly ancestors or cousins, But that's never been seen. How many millions of generations of fruit flies do we have now that have been grown in labs? And guess what? They're still fruit flies. They won't mate with house flies or anything else. So you've never seen the creation in a science lab. You've never seen the creation of a new species that is no longer able to mate with its close relatives or its closely related organisms. Sorry, that sounded gross, but so we see a lot of changes within a species, tremendous, but we've never actually seen a new species come about. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. That's good. That's good. So, so the next is that the change is cyclical, not directional. And I'm realizing I intended to put some slides in here, but unfortunately, it looks like they didn't stick in here. So I'll just describe this. One of the things that Darwin observes is the differences in the beaks of the finches on the different islands of the Galapagos Islands. And this was his time with the Galapagos Islands was one of the most formative with respect to changing his view that this descent with modification was the reason why we see so much variety in different species. That this was the source of all the different species on Earth. And one of the things that he noticed is that there are beaks that are different on these birds. Some have longer, thicker, harder beaks, and some have thinner, shorter, softer beaks. But it turns out that some studies were done on these finches, and what's going on with this is that in a population when the weather is really dry on the Galapagos Islands, so we think about there's birds with hard beaks and birds with soft beaks. Okay, when things are dry, the nuts get bigger and the nuts get harder from the dryness. And those birds who have harder, thicker beaks, they crack the nuts, whereas the softer, thinner beaks do not crack the harder, bigger nuts. So you see over time that the thicker, harder beaks, there's more of them during drought. And the descent over time, you get more and more thick-beaked, longer-beaked, harder-beaked birds. However, the drought ends, and now water comes. Okay? The genes for the softer, thinner beaks are still out there in the population. It now gets wet, and there's no advantage to having a harder, thicker beak. All of a sudden, you see that population completely shift right back to the thinner, softer beaks. Okay? And that's what happens during periods of wetness. You transition more to the softer, thinner beaks. During periods of dryness, you transition to the harder, thicker beaks. And the point is that that is not directional. That is cyclical change. Okay? So they always stay finches. It is just a difference in some properties of their beaks that give them advantage for certain climatic conditions. Does that make sense? So you see cyclical changes within these birds. Next is the concept of irreducible complexity. This is one of my favorite. So, certain systems are irreducibly complex. In other words, what that means is if you make it simpler and simpler and simpler, the process that we're talking about, whether it's a biochemical or an organ or whatever, there gets to be a point where you can't modify it by adding little pieces to it. Okay, because this is all gradual change by one little change, modification through descent. Okay? And I want to illustrate what this means here. So it's any system, irreducible complexity. What is it? It's any system of interacting parts in which the removal of any one part destroys the function of the whole system. An irreducibly complex system then requires each and every component to be in place before it will function in the first place. So let me give you an illustration here. This is the game of Mousetrap. And we've all played Mousetrap, and it's an incredibly complex and specific system that is designed to catch a plastic mouse. Okay? And if you've played this game, you know that any one little thing wrong with it and it doesn't work. But if you tweak it and modify it and perfect it, you can get that sucker to work in certain situations.
Almost never.
So there's lots of pieces to it, and if you were to, for example, take out the steps, you could probably tweak and build it. If you had a kid like Austin Myers on your Mousetrap team, he could retweak and build that thing even if you changed this system. But if you take it down to its basic core elements, the basic Mousetrap, you need everything on here. You need a baseboard. You need a little wire catch. You need the staples that hold these things down. You need a spring, and you need this lever bar that snaps down. Those 5 basic parts, you have to have them. If you take out any single part of that, you do not have a Mousetrap that will ever work. Okay? In other words, if the job of the Mousetrap is to catch a mouse, this would be considered an irreducibly complex system because you would have to have all the pieces in place for it to ever be a good mouse catcher in the first place. Okay? You can't get any less complex and still have a system in place. Do you understand? So what is going on here is that we have found lots and lots of irreducibly complex systems in the body. Not just in our body, but in the cells. And in fact, the idea of irreducible complexity is more appropriately related to the biochemistry of the cell in these incredibly complex biochemical systems. You take out one aspect of that and the whole system falls apart. We talked a little bit about that last week when we had the chicken and the egg slide, and we saw that, well, the DNA, you need the DNA to make the proteins. But the proteins are required to have the DNA translated, okay?
Right.
They're interdependent. Well, and you've got to have the RNA. Well, and you've got to have the cell for the machinery. But you don't have the cell unless you have the proteins to reproduce the DNA. And the point is that it all works in this very complex dance, all dependent on each other. The cell itself is an irreducibly complex organism. And then there are other biochemical systems. This is the bacterial flagellum on an E. coli. And the width of an E. coli bacterium cell is 1/100th the width of a human hair. You could line up 12,500 of these bacterial cells in 1 inch. It's a little teeny weeny thing. There's 240 distinct proteins on that bacterial flagellum. There's a little microscopic outboard motor, and you can see that thing spinning around there real fast. And it is brilliantly designed. That thing runs at 100,000 revolutions per minute. And it takes only a quarter turn to stop. In other words, 100,000 RPMs, and in a quarter turn it can stop and change direction.
Wow.
Okay? And this is much like the human brain in that our best engineers have not come up with something so wonderful as the bacterial flagellum. And this little system here is irreducibly complex. You see, it is made up of amazing engineering. It's got the propeller, the filament that's a propeller. It's got this hook here that's like a universal joint. It's got an outer membrane which holds it in place. There is little bushings that are here in the L ring and P ring. There is a rotor that spins. You've got these stators that the rotor sits in. I mean, it is a molecular piece of beautiful engineering. And the point of this is that, well, you can improve on the flagellum, okay? But when you take it down to its basic system, it is like a little outboard motor. It doesn't work without all the pieces in place. It is irreducibly complex. It is already engineered as a whole system and structure. You can't gradually get to it because you need the whole system in place before it'll work.
Right, so how would it be an advantage? If it's missing the propeller part, it doesn't matter how good the other stuff works. How can you evolve one piece at a time? Because that's what evolution says. Evolution can't create an engineered, fully developed thing like that. Evolution would say, well, first you evolved the S ring. And then that gave you a little evolutionary advantage over your mates. And so, but then maybe you evolved the hook. And then maybe a million years later, you got maybe the M ring. Well, what good would the M ring do you if you didn't have the hook? So how would that be an advantage to you? Right? Let's say you mutated and formed a filament propeller, but it didn't move. What advantage would that be? So, right? So it's like, how can you possibly evolve a little piece of that at a time? It doesn't give you any advantage, right? The only reason evolution supposedly works is because the little changes over time, each one is a slight advantage that makes itself passed on to the next generation. So that's why this is such a powerful argument against it, because there's no way to evolve a thing like that.
Right.
The little bitty changes, none of them will be helpful to you until the whole thing is together, functional, and working.
So Darwin, in his book on the origin of species, says this. He says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And what I'm telling you is that this notion of irreducible complexity, what we see in the bacterial flagellum, what we see in the biochemical factories of the cell, cannot evolve piece by piece. It is irreducibly complex. It has to have all the pieces together. The point being is that we see engineering, it's engineered.
Mm-hmm.
Next is transitional forms would be non-viable. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you're talking about going from one species to another species, we think about just as an example, a transition. Like we hear that birds evolved from reptiles, that dinosaurs were the parents of today's birds. Okay. What that means is that somewhere along the way, a creature would have to start losing its scales and start gaining feathers. But the problem is that the feather is an irreducibly complex structure. In other words, a half a feather doesn't allow you to fly. And while you're losing your scales, these transitional creatures are going to be at a disadvantage in the water, losing their scales. They're going to be at a disadvantage in the air because they can't fly yet. and they're going to have a disadvantage on land. All right? These are all things that would make them non-viable. They're going to have a disadvantage in being able to catch food. Okay? Because they don't have the structures that allowed them their advantage. They're losing them as they're transitioning to a new form. And so the point is that the only way that a feather is going to give you advantage is if it comes to you fully formed, fully made. Halfway is not an advantage. There is a selection disadvantage to that. Transitional forms would not be viable. And that's actually supported in the fossil record, where we don't see transition forms. Okay? We don't see them.
But they still teach it.
Next is molecular isolation. There's no ancestral relationships. This is a little bit complicated, but I'm gonna use this as an illustration here. Okay, I'm gonna use an illustration, and then I'm gonna tell you what it all is. We see things that are similar. Okay, and we conclude from that because there is similarity and because there is progression, that they must have been related with a common ancestor. So here we have the spoon, and it has a particular structure, and then we have a bigger spoon with a bigger cup area for holding things, and then we have here a structure with the handle, and yet an even bigger structure, and bigger yet with the handle, and now we've kind of lost the handle, and the shape of the handle is a little bit differently, but a bigger, and finally it has evolved to this master pot up here. Okay? And so we would look at that and say, because of the similarity and because of the progression, we would infer from that we had a common ancestor. That this here evolved
Can you guys see?
from the spoon.
Okay.
And it's on the basis of similarity and progression. Okay? Little incremental changes. Here's the problem. The argument is made that the evidence of common descent is the universal nucleic acid alphabet and genetic code. Okay? DNA, RNA, that is the coding in every form of life. And because of that, all life must have come from the same ancestor. That's the evolutionary common sense. DNA has similarity between apes and humans, about 85 to 95% similarity. And some would say that suggests a common ancestor. But I would point out that humans and mice have 90% commonality and similarity. And so does similarity and progression prove evolution? Like this here? Or does it suggest a common designer? I mean, after all, we're all living in the same biosphere. And so it makes sense that we would have some similarities in our biochemistry, because the source of molecules is the same on planet Earth for all living forms. All right? We have a common biosphere, which is why we're going to have a common molecular biology. Now, because DNA is a language, because it has the ACTG alphabet, I think we would expect to have a high degree of similarity between all organisms in our biochemistry. It's the same language. Let me give you an example here. So remember, DNA is a language, and so we use our English language to write a sentence like, Charles Darwin is a scientific god. Okay? And we could get another message, just like DNA is a message, that said this: Charles Darwin is a scientific dog. Now, these letters are identical, and the order is greater than 90% similar. Okay? And yet one slight change in that message yields completely opposite meanings, Vastly different meanings. You follow? Molecularly, it's the same way. We can use the same alphabet, but a few little code changes, so we have very similar DNA genes, but a few little code changes leads to vastly different messages, i.e., this little code change leads to a mouse, this little code change leads to an ape, this little code change leads to human beings. We have a similar language, we have similar genes, we have a similar alphabet, but one little change leads to huge differences in the meaning. It's the same thing in the DNA code. One little change has a huge difference in meaning. So saying that we've got the same DNA as an ape doesn't mean a thing about common ancestry. Got it? Okay.
Oh, question.
Yeah.
It's funny you made the dog and the God,
Yeah.
because I've always said that dogs are like God. They love you unconditionally.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's
That's
true.
good. That's good. I like that. Next, and last, this is my last comment. I know, and we're late, and I was hoping to. I'm not going to be able to get this done in time, so
It's
I'll
okay,
figure.
we can do it next week.
Yeah, we'll have to do this
Our
next week.
brains hurt.
Let me just finish molecular isolation because we haven't even started on the fossil record, guys.
Okay, go.
All right. So this is the progression that we're looking at. You know, when I was talking about non-viable transitional forms, but if we look at this basic progression from fish to amphibians, which amphibians are like frogs, you know, they live in water and on land. Reptiles that are land-based but look awfully similar to amphibians, and then to mammals. We would expect that if evolution was true between species, macroevolution, we would expect to find biochemical transition between them. And it's very interesting because just like we talked about genetic hard limits, in the biochemistry, you see no transitional biochemistry between fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals. It is a very distinctly different biochemistry. Instead of finding transitions, say amphibians being in between fish and reptiles, we don't find that at all. What we find is that at the molecular level, there's no trace of evolutionary transition. There's only gaps between each of these. Despite the same alphabet, the same genetic code, we see gaps between fish and amphibians. We see gaps between amphibians and reptiles. We see gaps between reptiles and mammals. In other words, the molecular aspects in the cells are distinct, just like the genetic limits are distinct for a species. We see that on a molecular level, it is distinct. We do not see that amphibians are kind of halfway between fish and reptiles. They get their own set of biochemical proteins, cells, energy, and the like. So anyway, there is molecular isolation. There's not a molecular transition. That's the point that I want to make. That's what molecular isolation means. Okay? We don't see molecular transition. We see each has a distinct set of biochemistry. So anyway, we're going to stop with that. That is only 5 out of 6 evidences on why natural selection does not explain macroevolution or speciation. I've got one more, which is the fossil record, which is also very important, and then we'll move on from there. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you very
good
much.
job. Woo-hoo.